All right, I guess we can go ahead and get started then. I want to take a minute to introduce and welcome Dr. Megan Fork. Dr. Fork is joining us from Westchester University, where she is an assistant professor, and she also runs the Aquatic Ecosystem Lab. And she's going to be talking to us today about unregulated contaminants in our water ecosystems.
Thank you for the introduction, and I'll practice sharing my screen, so hopefully it will go this time. Okay, so hopefully now you see the screen. So great, awesome. Like focusing. I'm going to talk a little bit about regulated contaminants in streams and rivers. I'll talk a little bit about where they come from, what they do, and what we can do to keep our water clean. And before I get into all of that stuff, start with my acknowledgments so that I'm not like trying to race through them at the end. So I'm going to be talking about work that has had many people contribute to it and funding from a few different organizations. So I'll talk a little bit about pharmaceuticals with some collaborators from Carey Institute and the Baltimore Ecosystem Study. I'll talk a little bit about trash, kind of macroplastics, with a bunch of contributions from Westchester University students, past and present. And I'll talk a little bit about road salt as kind of a bonus at the end for a couple of minutes with a few named people and then hundreds of people that contributed to the sampling. So I'm going to start off with a definition of emerging contaminants. So when I'm using the term emerging contaminants, I'm talking about this whole suite of chemical and biological materials. And really the only thing they have in common is that they are not really considered very commonly. And they don't have really clear regulatory status. They're usually unregulated or not strongly regulated. But we know that they are likely to affect human or ecological health. So some examples of these things are flame retardants, pharmaceuticals and personal care products, nanomaterials like nanometals and things like that, algal toxins like the ones in harmful algal blooms, industrial chemicals like PCBs and the PFAS that we hear more and more about, it feels like, pesticides, microplastics, so a whole bunch of different stuff. And in the interest of not talking at you for like 8 hours, I'm only going to talk about a few of these. So I'll tell two kind of main stories, one about pharmaceuticals in Baltimore streams, and then another about plastics in streams in southeastern Pennsylvania, with a little bonus dessert of road salt in Pennsylvania. So I'll start with pharmaceuticals. A little bit of background information we should know about pharmaceuticals is that they are ubiquitous in freshwater systems. So basically everywhere we have looked for pharmaceuticals, we find them, and that includes streams in remote parts of national parks, streams in Siberia, streams in Alaska, all over the place. And that's sort of what this bottom figure is showing. It's showing this nationwide survey of organic pollutants, including pharmaceuticals, in streams throughout the United States. And every dot that we see is an observation, and we see only 2 streams here that had kind of undetectable levels of organic contaminants in them. And this is partly driven by the fact that we are making and distributing more and more different kinds of pharmaceuticals every year, which is what this graph on the right is showing us. So we're seeing this proportional change relative to 1970 in the number of pharmaceuticals that are approved for use in the US. And you can just see this like ongoing climb and climb and climb over the decades in the number of pharmaceutical products that we have available. Another thing we know about pharmaceuticals is that they can disrupt the physiological and ecological processes that are happening in the environment, even at very low concentrations. And in fact, that's what they're designed to do, right? We take a small amount of a pharmaceutical, a few milligrams in a pill, and it's designed to have an effect on our whole body. So several kilograms. So we're talking about, orders of magnitude difference between the amount that we take and the amount of stuff it's supposed to affect. And another thing we know about pharmaceuticals is that because we are taking them and then we are excreting them into our wastewater, that the effluent that comes out from wastewater treatment plants is a pretty well-known source of pharmaceutical pollution to streams. So a lot of studies of pharmaceutical pollution have taken place at the outlet of wastewater treatment plants. And I do want to point out that this is not because the wastewater treatment plants are not doing their job. They are designed for what we might consider like traditional contaminants. They're designed to remove microbes that make us sick. They are designed to remove nutrients that contribute to fish kills and eutrophication and stuff like that. And they are really good at doing what they are designed for. They are just simply not designed for removing pharmaceuticals, because at the time that we designed and built these, we didn't even know that this was a problem. So they're doing a really good job at what they're designed for. They're not designed to remove pharmaceuticals. But I'm going to leave behind the wastewater treatment plants anyway, because the question that we wanted to ask with the research I'm going to talk about today is, okay, in the absence of wastewater treatment plant effluent, the leaks and failures that we know happen in our aging wastewater infrastructure, how do they contribute to pharmaceutical pollution? And if they do, how much pharmaceutical pollution is coming from those leaks and failures in our wastewater infrastructure? And to do this, we studied streams in Baltimore, so Baltimore, Maryland. And this is the watershed where we looked. So down here in this lower arrow, we're sort of we're a little bit south of kind of the main center city part of Baltimore, but our watershed extends up into the suburbs. And then we even have a small reference watershed up here where we have just forest and then some low density residential area with septic systems. So across this landscape in urban to suburban Baltimore, we collected samples from 7 different sites along the stream, kind of from the downtown urban areas all the way up to our reference sites. We sampled weekly and screened for 92 different pharmaceuticals, and kind of over all of our samples, we found 37 different compounds in 11 different pharmaceutical classes. And I'll talk about what I mean by those pharmaceutical classes in just a second. And then all of our samples were also co-located with measurements of stream flow, which allows us to calculate the total amount of pharmaceuticals moving through. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the patterns of concentration, pharmaceutical pollution that we see over space. So on the x-axis of this graph, I'm showing the different sites, those 7 different sites where we collected samples, and they are arranged in order of increasing population density. So further right, we're sort of more toward the downtown parts of Baltimore, and up here we're in our forest and our kind of exurban low density residential. And then here on that are kind of arranged vertically. I've got those different classes of pharmaceuticals. So things like antidepressants are grouped together. Things like antibiotics, antifungals, analgesics. So that's like painkillers like Tylenol and stuff like that are all grouped together. Antihistamines for allergy medication and stuff like that. And then the intensity of the color in this graph shows us how many of our samples we detected that kind of pharmaceutical in. So some things to take away from here are that we detected antidepressants kind of across the board. regardless of the density of human population. Whereas things like antibiotics, we start to see this trend. The more people there are, the more detections we have of antibiotics. Same thing with our painkillers. And then if we look top to bottom, in the sites where we have a higher population density, we see more of these different classes, so more different kinds of pharmaceuticals showing up. And then when we look at the concentration, we also see this pattern of increasing concentration. So more different kinds of drugs and more of them, the more people that live in our watershed. And that just makes sense because people are the source of these things. So now I'm going to zoom in a little bit just on the most population dense, the closest to downtown Baltimore that we have. And this is our site that is located at Carroll Park. So this is the name of the site. Here we found a subset of, we found 16 different pharmaceuticals from 9 different classes over our year of sampling. And I just want to point out the most commonly detected compound that we found was an antibiotic called trimethoprim, which we found in just under half of our samples. And the highest concentration we detected was of acetaminophen, which is the active ingredient in Tylenol. So now I want to talk a little bit about the patterns that we see, or really to tip my hand a little bit, the complete lack of pattern that we see over the course of a year. So here in the upper left, I'm showing the total concentration of pharmaceuticals that we measured, kind of summed across all of the different kinds of things that we found. And I want to point out this, where I've got this sort of teal aqua arrow here is really, it's a pretty small concentration. We're talking about nanograms per liter. So this is a very low, this is a very small amount, very tiny amount. It's really the equivalent of a few pinches of salt in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And I feel like that makes, if I tell you that, it makes it really easy to say, oh, there's hardly anything here. But remember, when we're talking about pharmaceuticals, right, we're talking about something that is designed to have a biological effect at a really low concentration. So even though we're looking at really small concentrations, we know from previous research that they matter. They do stuff to fish, they do stuff to algae. They can affect how that ecosystem is behaving. And so if we look at this total concentration over time, there's not really any part of the year where we see higher concentrations or lower. It's just sort of dipping up and down. And if we look at the different classes of pharmaceuticals, we see similar things. They're not really moving together, and they're sort of, it seems sort of random when we see them or not. So basically the takeaway here, not really any times of year where we see more or less pharmaceuticals, and they're not really behaving in a way that suggests they're like all coming in together or not. And usually we see these patterns where either we see dilution at high flow, or so like when we have, if something is coming from a leaking pipe in one place in the stream, when we get more water in the stream during a rainstorm, we'll see that source being diluted. And so we'll see lower concentrations at higher stream flow, which I'm abbreviating by Q here. And sometimes if we see something that is kind of coming from the landscape, when we get more rain, the rain is washing that in, and so we would see higher concentrations. But here we really see no pattern at all. So a lot of the typical tools that we use to model these things don't work for pharmaceuticals because we don't have those same patterns. But what we do know is that we found a lot of different kinds of pharmaceuticals in environmentally relevant concentrations in our stream. So the answer to our first question here is yes, we do see leaks and failures of wastewater infrastructure are contributing to pharmaceutical pollution in this stream. So the next question we want to answer is, okay, so how much? And I've been talking about concentration a lot, and that's really important when we care about like the salamanders, the fish, the bugs that are living in our specific stream. But if we care how much is getting to the Chesapeake Bay, downstream of Baltimore, then we need to start thinking about how much actual stuff per time are we getting into the stream, not just the concentration. So to do that, we calculate load, which is a mass per time, which we get by calculating the concentration and multiplying by the amount of water moving through the stream. And so we can calculate these as annual loads, which is what we have here. So again, we're seeing these different pharmaceutical classes, the analgesics, antibiotics, antidepressants that we've seen before. We've got a few different ways of estimating this, so that's why you see a few different symbols here, but they're mostly clustered together. And what we really see is that for most of our different kinds of pharmaceuticals, we've got somewhere between like half a kilogram, so about a pound, somewhere between 1 to 10 pounds of these pharmaceuticals moving through the stream every year. And then a little bit more than that when we're looking at the analgesics like Tylenol. And if you are like me, a few pounds of one of these things is like a meaningless number. So let's put some context to this. How many doses are we talking about moving through this stream in a given year? And so we can think, I just highlighted a few here. So about 30,000, the equivalent of 30,000 Tylenol tabs, the equivalent of somewhere between about 1,000 to 2,500 doses of antibiotics, and somewhere between about 9,000 to 51,000, a little bit bigger spread on our estimates there of antidepressants going through the stream every year. And we can put that into a little bit more context by thinking about how much of the stuff that people use is ending up in the stream through these leaks and failures in wastewater infrastructure. So we're going to start with the antibiotic trimethoprim, which was the one that we detected most frequently in this stream. And so I'm going to walk you through piece by piece one of these Sankey plots, which I don't know, I see them all the time on Reddit, but if you're not familiar with it, we're going to start at the left with how much of this stuff people use every year, and then kind of trace the different places that it ends up. So I have some notes here in the bottom about how I calculated these numbers, which I'm happy to take questions about, but I'm not going to go into too much detail kind of in the interest of time. So I'm going to just cut to the chase. So we, like, in this watershed in Baltimore, this subset of Baltimore, we estimated that people are using about 24 kilograms of trimethoprim every year. And in general, our bodies don't metabolize antibiotics like this very much. So most of that trimethoprim is excreted unchanged into our wastewater, into our sewage. And then we estimated that about 1% of the sewage leaks on its way to the wastewater treatment plant. So through failures or overflows or something like this. I do want to point out that Baltimore does have separate sewer system. So unlike Philadelphia, which is close to where I live, which has a combined sewer system and probably leaks a lot more cross sewage into our streams because of that, Baltimore has a separate sewer system, but it's very old. And so it has failures, it has leaks and things like that. So that leaking sewage, we assume, goes directly to the stream. The wastewater treatment plant is outside of our particular watershed, and it is released into a different river, that effluent. But we assume that a little bit is retained in that wastewater treatment plant, but like we talked about, a lot of it can move through and be released in the effluent. And so then when we combine the effects of the leaking sewage directly into Gwynns Falls, one of the streams in Baltimore, and compare that, add that up with the amount that is released in effluent, we estimate that a little bit under half of what people are taking in terms of the antibiotics makes it into the inner harbor, which is part of the Chesapeake Bay. And we can compare that to acetaminophen, which is the active ingredient in Tylenol. And here people are taking about 1,000 times more Tylenol than they are taking trimethoprim, which makes sense. Anytime I have a headache, I'm popping that stuff. But a difference between Tylenol and trimethoprim is that our bodies metabolize a lot more of the Tylenol. And so what that means is most of what people are taking is actually changed by our bodies, and very little of it is excreted unchanged into sewage. But some of that, still about 1% of that sewage is leaking. And so ultimately, we're getting a total load to the harbor that is pretty similar for Tylenol, despite the fact that we're using about 1,000 times more. And so ultimately, kind of the take-home message of this part of the story is that leaks and failures in aging infrastructure are contributing pharmaceuticals to streams. And I want to put this into a little bit of context by saying the American Society of Civil Engineers I think this is the 2025 report card number, telling us our wastewater infrastructure gets a grade of D+, not great. And as you can probably guess, this is exacerbated by historical disinvestment and inequities in funding availability to take care of our infrastructure and improve it and build new infrastructure. Okay, so what can we do as people living in the world who don't want to live in a pharmaceutical polluted world? One of the major things we can do is dispose properly of our expired or unneeded pharmaceuticals. So that means using take-back programs that are usually, I feel like around here at least, they're usually run by a police department, but not flushing them down the toilet when we don't need them anymore. Instead, sending them to programs where they will take them back and incinerate them. And we can also support infrastructure upgrades that are environmentally responsible and cost share progressively in our communities. Okay, so from here, I'm going to shift to part 2. We're going to talk about trash and plastic. And I think many of us have seen and been moved by these images of wildlife, especially in the marine environment, interacting with and being harmed by plastics. And so we know about a lot of this stuff from the marine environment, but a lot of the trash that makes it to the ocean originates on land, and about the majority of that is delivered through rivers into the ocean. So when I'm talking here, I'm going to start again with a little bit of a definition of microplastics. So here I'm talking about any plastics that are bigger than about 5 millimeters, so that are bigger than about like the eraser of a pencil. And so these are things that can entangle, trap, and injure animals. Another problem that they cause for animals is that they can mistake them for food, and so they'll fill up their bellies with plastic that provides no nutrition and eventually starve to death. Another thing that is bad about plastics is that they can leach or sorb, so have harmful chemicals stick to them, and so then they're kind of Trojan horses for these other contaminants. Of course, macroplastics can degrade into microplastics, which we know we find throughout our bodies, and we're still learning about the health impacts of them. And then another thing I want to point out is that finding macroplastics in the environment can counteract a lot of the mental health benefits that we know we get from being in nature. So if we go out in nature and take a walk in the forest along a beautiful stream, it helps us to feel better. It improves our mental health. But if we do the same along a stream that is riddled with trash, we don't get those benefits. And being aware of this, people have passed a lot of policies to help reduce plastic waste in the environment. So here is a map of the different policies that we see kind of among states in the United States. Green states are ones where we have statewide single-use plastic bans. Orange ones, like Pennsylvania, where I'm located, are ones where we have local, so like municipal scale towns and cities, having plastic bag bans. And if we zoom in on Pennsylvania, down here in the southeast of Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia, where I'm located, is where most of those single-use plastic bans are, which makes it perfect for us to conduct a quote-unquote natural experiment comparing streams in cities and towns with these plastic bans and without. So we want to ask a couple of questions here about how much of the trash in urban streams is types that would be affected by typical bans. So how much of it is single-use plastics? And do these bans actually reduce the amount of trash in streams? And so to answer this question, we compared 9 different streams throughout southeastern Pennsylvania. So you can see that sort of big gray blob down in the lower right is Philadelphia. And then we've got 3 watersheds here in green where we've had single-use plastic bans for our entire study. 3 in yellow where we have some data before and after the enforcement of a ban went into place. And 3 that are red where we have had no bans for the duration of the study. And we have pretty similar mean urban development among all of these categories, and they're all about the same size, which lets us compare them pretty confidently. So at each of these sites, we sampled 4 riparian plots, so on the stream bank, and we collected every piece of trash that we could find, and then 1 sample from within the stream, like on the stream bed, every time we visited. We visited 12 times between September 2023 and December 2024, so about 12 times over about 18 months. And we brought all the trash we collected back to the lab. We rinsed and dried each item, and then we recorded its size, how much it weighed, what it was made out of, what we thought it might have been used for, and its color. And so some preliminary results from this, because we're still working on churning through the data, even though it's been almost a year since we stopped collecting it. We've found trash pretty much everywhere in about 96% of the stream bank samples, and just over 90% of the stream bed samples had at least 1 piece of trash in them. So far, we have cataloged a total of about 11,500 pieces of trash, and added all together, that's about 338 pounds of trash that we have collected. And I still have data to enter for this project, so we're not done yet. Those are not final numbers. And what we find here is that most of the trash that we collected is made out of plastic film, sort of like single-use grocery bags, which are the target of these bans. So that would lead us to think that, likely the bans are targeting the stuff that is most common, so we might see an effect of those bans. We see also a lot of plastic. So plastic film is in that dark blue there on kind of the upper right. We see a lot of plastic that is not that plastic film, so other kinds of plastic, like the first thing I thought of was sauce containers, like from barbecue sauce from McDonald's or something like that, but also plastic buckets and shovels and I mean, there's so much stuff made out of plastic. We find a lot of it, plastic cups, etc. Glass was also a very common, so broken glass, bottles and things, mostly bottles. And then smaller amounts of kind of a lot of other materials, but really plastic film and plastic being the most dominant stuff that we see. Okay, so the real question here is, do we see effects of bans? We see some differences, but they point the other way. So if we look at these stream bank samples, the riparian samples on the left, we see there are more single-use plastics per unit area in the places that have a ban versus not. So I don't think this necessarily means that bans are failing us. Instead, I think what this tells us is that bans are being placed in the past in the places where we see the most need for them. And maybe we need to wait a little bit longer to see the effects of them bringing the amount of trash down. Sort of similarly, but not quite so dramatically, on the right in the stream bed, so within the stream itself, we don't see any difference in the amount of single-use plastics between places that have and do not have a ban. We also, I know that we're here kind of to talk under the umbrella of equity, so I wanted to talk a little bit about that as well. And so I wanted to look at, do we see any differences based on kind of the socio-demographics of our watershed? And when we look at the amount of trash in our watershed, we don't see any pattern with the kind of percent of people living in poverty. So here, if we just look at total trash, we don't really see any patterns with kind of those socio-demographics. But if we zoom in just to plastic, so here I've added together plastic and plastic film, now we see a positive trend. So we see more plastic per unit area in places where we have greater poverty. And this is probably more of a symptom of what it's like to live in poverty. We know that these places are can often be food deserts, and so we have a lot more packaged processed food that is packaged in plastic. We also probably have fewer services in places where people are living in poverty, so we have less reliable trash pickup and things like that. So lots of kind of inequity that is being reflected in the amount of trash in the stream, in addition to so many other ways that we see this. And so I want to point out, this is still research in progress. So we are still working on analyzing our data and answering some of these questions. We have some other things that we're looking forward to analyzing, but I'm not going to dwell here too much in the interest of time. And I want to instead talk for a couple more minutes about my little bonus dessert about road salt. So road salt is another unregulated contaminant in streams. We don't really consider it an emerging contaminant because it's been around for a long time. But we have been putting more and more and more of it on our roads every year. So here we're looking at trends in road salt application over time between 1940, when we kind of first started salting our roads, up to 2020. And you can see this dramatic increase in the amount of salt being applied to roads. So why? I mean, we know that we're putting salt down to keep people safe in winter weather. Why am I harping about this? Well, it does a lot of negative things as well, right? So you probably, if you live in a place where it gets cold and we apply road salt, you know how bad it is for your car. It's also really bad for our infrastructure. So bridges that should last 50 to 60 years are becoming unsafe in 20 to 30 because of road salt damage. So this is costing taxpayers money. It's making driving on bridges less safe. It's also increasing the cost of treating water. So down at the bottom here, I've got an image of kind of like an industrial scale reverse osmosis machine, which is what we need to start using when our water gets really salty. And road salt was also implicated in why, if you like, I know this is a few years ago now, but if you remember back to the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, road salt was part of what made the water there so toxic, corroding the pipes and exposing so many people to really harmful lead pollution. So also related to over application of road salt. And then, of course, I think you can imagine that organisms used to living in fresh water who are then exposed to salt water are having a bad time. So harmful to aquatic life to have too much road salt pollution. And to get a better sense of what this looks like, we have done a few now salt snapshots with hundreds of volunteers measuring the scope of pollution. And so here's just a quick look at a map from our Pennsylvania area, where we've got hundreds of samples documenting road salt pollution, where the average concentration of 205 milligrams per liter is well above the recommended threshold to avoid hazard, and above the chronic toxicity threshold that is set for Canada and almost at the chronic toxicity threshold for the US. And then our maximum samples, we were measuring 6,000 milligrams per liter, well above all of these standards. Okay, so what can we do if we're concerned about road salt pollution? We can shovel or plow before we apply road salt. We can be proactive in thinking about the temperatures, apply our road salt before we get ice, rather than trying to remove ice with salt. We can use salt at the recommended rate. Adding more does not help it melt faster or better. And we can add some grit like gravel or sand instead of relying on salt entirely. So summing up kind of the main parts of this talk about pharmaceuticals and plastics, both of them are everywhere in places where humans are. They both negatively impact streams and infrastructure and our drinking water supplies. And the consequences of these pollutants are both distributed unequally. So we have equity issues associated with both pharmaceutical and plastic pollution. And so now I'm going to, I guess I will stop sharing, and then I'll share again if we wanted to talk about anything, but I would love to take whatever questions anybody has.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. I guess I'll go ahead. I have a few. Just now you had talked about the toxicity thresholds for the salt in water and the US versus Canadian numbers. Like the US was almost 2 times the Canadian. Do you know why there's such a difference, or like how there is such a difference?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Canada has a lot more lakes than us, and so the thing about salt into a lake is once it's there, it's there forever, pretty much. And so I think they have a lot more stringent policies than us, both because they have a lot more lakes to protect and just by virtue of Canada generally being a little bit more progressive about environmental policy than the United States. So we're still that 50 milligram number actually comes from Maryland. So Maryland has sort of slightly stronger regulations than most of the rest of the U.S. for reasons of protecting the Chesapeake Bay, but our federal standard is a lot more lax than Canada, as you point out.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. I did also want to ask from the beginning, um, do you know if there's different kinds of pharmaceutical like classifications that are more or less harmful on the ecosystems that they're found in?
That is a great question, and that is still very much an open question. So, kind of the way that we have historically studied contaminants like pharmaceuticals is just like how much does there need to be before things start dying, right? So toxicity is kind of based on these studies where what is the concentration that it takes to kill 50% of the animals that I'm looking at, and we're going to say that's its toxicity. But we have recently realized that there are a lot of these sublethal effects of a lot of different kinds of pharmaceuticals, and really at very early stages of understanding those. A lot of people have done, or like we're just starting to get some studies of what antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication does to animals. We see a lot of differences in behavior that are coming from the kinds of concentrations that we see in the environment. We find there's a study from some folks in Florida that dose crayfish with antidepressants, and they what it is that makes the crayfish bolder, so they're less likely to hide, which makes them more likely to be eaten by predators. So we can see both kind of that accumulation of that pharmaceutical as we move up the food web, because our critters are more likely to get eaten. And it means that we have fewer crayfish in the environment, and the kind of things that crayfish do, like help aerate the soil and things like that. We also know that it changes how successful fish are going to be at migrating and things like that. So migrating salmon are affected. There is a lot of evidence that shows that antibiotics at these kind of relatively low, like not yet toxic concentrations in the environment can promote antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So that's another kind of worry that we have. But where we are really lacking understanding is how the mixtures affect organisms. So we know that they're swimming around in this mixture, and basically all of the studies that people do are on one single compound at a time. So we really don't understand these kind of like chemical cocktails that things are being exposed to. It was a pretty long answer to a question, but
No, that was a good answer. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? I've got one more. Oh yeah, Ariana.
Hi. Sorry, I'm on my phone, but I'm Ari. So I really liked your talk. Thank you so much. And I'm gonna put my hand down. Thank you so much for all of that information. I was curious about back to the pharmaceuticals, where I mean, it just sounds like there's a lot of players and potential places to put the blame on it. You know, like it could be the people taking the pharmaceuticals, it could be the pharmaceutical companies, it could be the governments with the, terrible infrastructure and things. So amongst those groups, is there any sort of like infighting and placing blame? And so at that point, who can take responsibility and make, seems like the infrastructure is the best solution, but if the people responsible for infrastructure are placing the blame somewhere else, like how do we get to that resolution, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I feel like it is. I feel like this is a thing where we all kind of need to pull together to get a solution. So I think we could the European Union has passed this resolution that we need to stop over prescribing antibiotics. So we could take it as far back as like there are too many prescriptions being written, right? But also like people are taking medication to improve their health and be healthy. And I don't think that we should not take medication that our doctors are prescribing us. I think we should be, taking care of our bodies. So I think with the things that we as people can do are to, do our best to dispose of our medications properly. We're not just like flushing a bottle of expired Tylenol down the toilet and potentially having to get the water supply. I think there are improving wastewater treatment technology. We have these kind of like next generation wastewater treatment technologies that we can start to be implementing, and we can do our governments, our utilities can do work to implement those and to fix up our water infrastructure. That might mean higher rates and higher taxes that we need to pay. And so I think thinking about progressive ways to spread the cost among people and not overburdening communities that are already being asked to pay kind of more than their fair share and things like that. So I know that I'm trying to like take the idea of blame and turn it toward responsibility, I feel like, and thinking forward about what should we all be doing going forward. And I think that looks like people who can afford higher rates and higher taxes should be paying them so that we can spread those benefits equally among people too.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks.
Anyone else have any questions? I did have one more. I guess I'll just go ahead. You were talking about the plastic ban experiment, and how you think it would be better to see results in time. Do you have any plans on doing something similar to that down the line to see if that is something that will change? Or are you going to try to leave that to someone else to figure out?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know you know well how much work this project is. So I think, I talked with some other folks throughout the United States about this project at a conference in May. And one of the people that I talked to had been studying a plastic bag ban in Cincinnati, Ohio. And they found that it was like after 2 or 3 years that they started to see effects. So I think once enough time has gone past that I have forgotten how much of a pain and how much work it was to do this. I do think we might do one more round of sampling kind of like a year or two after maybe another year or two from now to get a long-term sample coming out. And then we also like the data that I was showing and that I have had opportunity to analyze go to May 2024 when a lot of our bans went into place in January 2024. But we do have data that go till December of 2024. So I'm hoping that we start to see some differences in trends once I have the chance to enter and clean and analyze the data that are on data sheets still in the lab here.
I'm sure you'll get there.
Yeah,
however long it takes. But all right, that sounds good. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? All right, if not, then thank you, Dr. Fork, so much for your time, and thank you for your amazing talk. It was really insightful. I think that's all.
thank you all so much, and thanks for taking time out of your day or evening or whatever time it is where you are, to listen about a kind of a depressing topic. So thanks.
Well, I think education is the best road to a solution, so it's important to talk about. And if anyone who wasn't able to attend, that anyone knows, it will be recorded, and I think it will be posted on the website. And if anybody wants to watch it back, if they missed any details, it will be on the website, and you can go ahead and check it out. But with that, I think the speaker series is over. Again, thank you, Dr. Fork, so much for your time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cool.